Let's get started, shall we? Yama, everyone, and welcome to the National Library and to our second Deadly Dialogue event. I would like to start off by paying my respects and acknowledging the Australia's First Nations people, the first Australians as the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and of all the lands where you're tuning in to us from tonight, and to give my respect to elders past and present, and through them to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. My name's Rebecca Bateman. I'm a Whalewood and Gamilaroi woman from the northwest part of New South Wales, and I'm the Acting Director of Indigenous Engagement here at the National Library. I'm thrilled to welcome you to Deadly Dialogues number 2, which is the second in a series of 3 Deadly Dialogue events exploring first-hand experiences from First Nations performing artists. Deadly Dialogues is a new series of in-conversation style events, which is an extension of the current on-stage exhibition, a celebration of performing arts in Australia. And Deadly Dialogues gives us the opportunity to hear first-hand experiences from First Nations performing artists that have told stories on stage, through everything from body language to the oldest living languages in the world. We're privileged this evening to have a wonderful guest with us today, and I would love to introduce, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Deborah Cheetham to the library. Deborah is a Yorta Yorta woman, soprano, composer, and educator. In 2009, Deborah established Short Black Opera as a national non-for-profit opera company devoted to providing training and performance opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander performance artists. The following year, she produced the premiere of her first opera, Pecan Summer, the score of which is in the on-stage exhibition upstairs. I'm not going to take up too much time because I know you'd much rather listen to Deborah and to Rhianna, but I would just also like to extend my welcomes and thanks to Rhianna. Rhianna Patrick is here tonight to lead us on this journey, and Rhianna is a Torres Strait Islander woman with connections to Mayor and Mabag clans of Torres Strait. Rhianna is a media professional of extensive experience and has spent nearly 2 decades at the ABC working across news and television documentaries and presenting national radio programs. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Deborah and to Rhianna, and we'll get this yarn started.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I too just wish to acknowledge the lands on which we meet, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present from where we are. I've flown in from other lands. These lands are not my own as a Torres Strait Islander, and I have no bloodline connection to them. Deb, would you like to give an acknowledgement?
I would, and if you'll permit me, I'd like to speak in my grandmother's language, Yorta Yorta language. I do that because I can now. And that's been a long time coming, so. Nyanak nitel dea imelang, wamaraban, nanawal, namri waka, inalochpa yota yota waka, galnyan yakaramja, nyanyak nitel dea imelang, galnya yakaramja, yenbena bapparabanarak. So in Yorta Yorta, I just explained that we're gathered here on this land of the Ngunnawal, and I also acknowledge the Ngambri people. We live on lands that were taken from us in such brutality that there are still today the scars and the wounds that exist between close neighbours. I acknowledge that this is beautiful country, that I was speaking in the language of the Yorta Yorta people, and that the people of this land that we gather on this evening, where we share knowledge and insight, has had people long time living here, Bapparabanarak, long time living here. And it's such a privilege actually to be able to speak in my grandmother's language all these years. It took a long time So thank you for affording me that.
When I was doing this dive into opera, Deb, and going back and having a look and, thinking about opera's historic centre, which is always focused on Western Europe, since the first ever public opera house was opened in Venice in the 1630s, and the traditions that have set then, which have continued through to now. And I was thinking about that art form that opera is and how many elements it brings together in its storytelling. Drama, poetry, visual arts, sometimes even dance, which are used to interact with the music, the voice, the staging, can't forget the staging, to bring the audience, I guess, into the heart of that story. And, when I was thinking about it, I also realised that it's also more than that. Opera has this way of connecting us to our emotion. It really hits us in a different way as an expressive form, I think. It can make you really, really angry. It can make you incredibly sad. It can make you laugh like there's no tomorrow. But it can also leave you feeling uplifted and inspired as well. And I think it does all of this sometimes, and more often than not, in a language that you might not understand either. So it's quite a powerful medium. But it's also an art form, I think, which is being challenged. It's being challenged to correct the way that it's told stories in the past. It's being challenged to bring classic works into the way that societal views are now in 2022, and it's being challenged for the voices that it might have excluded in the past. And Deb, I've always wondered what your first opera experience was and how you started on this journey.
Wow. Well, I can put you right there, and I can tell you the date, I can tell you the year, I can tell you the seat number I was sitting in the Sydney Opera House. The 19th of February 1979, I sat in row L, seat number 23. Dame Joan Sutherland came waltzing down this magnificent staircase in the Belle Epoque style as the Merry Widow. And it was one of those moments I thought, how did I not know about this before? Who's been keeping this from me? This is the most incredible thing. It certainly helped that the greatest opera singer that the world has ever known was, in the title role. But I just fell in love with opera at that moment. And a lot of people will say to me, oh, Leha, yes, that's a very easy access point to opera, of course. Musical theatre, almost, not quite. Operetta, there's a difference. But later that same week, I went and saw Yanufa, which is about the bleakest opera that there is, thanks Janáček. So I knew that I was in love with opera as a form. And everything you said about it then, in that beautiful succinct summary right from the 1600s and that first opera house in Venice, did that not sound familiar to you? Are not all of those elements something that we have been doing on this land, this continent, with the oldest continuing music practice in the world? Is that not ceremony? And I am and will remain, as a soprano, as a lyric soprano, eternally grateful to the Italians for their development of bel canto, or beautiful singing technique. But I'm telling you, I do not and never have seen opera as something that is Eurocentric. I think we invented it right here, and we have remained connected to telling our stories through that musical narrative for millennia. So for me, the great opera houses of Europe that grew up out of those little secretive conversations between the members of the Florentine Camerata all that time ago, that is really, for me, a kind of continuation of what began on this continent.
So Deb, you said then that that's where you fell in love with opera. When
that was the question, wasn't it? That's right. That's when I fell in love with opera, yeah, that night in 1979.
But then where does that then, I guess, where does that transition into you going, this is what I want to do?
Straight away then I knew that was what I wanted to do. My parents had invested a lot in my training as a tennis player. And at the time, I'm very happy to say that my tennis partner and I were the under 14 doubles champions of New South Wales. But the thing was, the moment that I saw opera, I wanted to be like Joan, but no one will ever be like Joan. But I thought, I want to be like Yvonne Kenny, for instance. My parents were still hopeful that I'd be like Yvonne Goolagong, but they had to get used to the idea that right from that moment I knew that I wanted to do that. And I wasn't seeing that it wasn't really possible for someone of my colour to make it onto that stage. But it was another 2.5 years before I did see someone of colour on that stage, and that was Leona Mitchell singing the role of Tosca. And it suddenly hit me, hang on, I haven't seen anyone of colour on this stage until you. And then after her, no one for a very long time. In fact, no one at all.
Well, if we fast forward from your early years to the career that you've had, I want to know that point where, how did Pecan Summer come to you?
Wow. I guess just to sort of backfill a little bit of information, I went through my undergraduate degree at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. I didn't have much success with the singing teacher who I was assigned to there, but I knew that singing was part of my DNA. Everyone in my Yorta Yorta family is a singer. Uncle Jimmy is the most famous and most celebrated, but he would often say to me, Bob, your mum, my younger sister, had the best voice in the family. Least opportunity, but she had the best voice. And I just think, well, I'm so grateful to inherit that from my mum and to inherit my musicality from you. But when I graduated from the Sydney Conservatorium, I was thinking, I don't know how I can be a singer. It had kind of been driven out of me almost that desire to sing. I'd had a really difficult time there. And for a couple of years, I didn't sing, I didn't pursue it. I graduated with a Bachelor of Music Education. I went straight into teaching. And I thought, well, I'm going to help other people sing. Yeah. But it was too deep within me, in my DNA, to tell my story, to live my life, to give meaning to everything in it in the way that my ancestors had. And that is through music, the most truthful way of expressing or knowing anything. And so eventually, after a couple of years of not singing, I thought, no, I just have to. And I started to produce my own shows. In fact, I set up my own little company. Short Black Productions was my very first little company, and I registered it and everything. I felt very good about that. And I used to put on little shows at the Studio Theatre, if you know it, in Newtown, in Sydney. And I think the first show was Death Scenes and Drama Queens. So I'd sing a bunch of arias and I'd explain how the soprano dies in each one of them, because apparently in opera the soprano must meet a horrible fate, and we'll talk about that. And then there was more Death Scenes and Drama Queens, because there just are. And so I'd been writing these shows that were all about someone else's music, and I was singing, the repertoire that I'd learned throughout my training. And I started to realise that I needed to get closer to the truth of who I am and how I exist as an artist in this world. And really what came first, before Pecan Summer, was White Baptist Aberfan. Still, I was using the music of other composers. Still, I hadn't written anything for myself at that stage, but that was really the catalyst for so many other opportunities, because I, by that stage, had reconnected with my biological family. I had realised by that stage I was a member of the Stolen Generations. I'd reconnected with my mother, Monica, and I told our story of reconnection and a lot of other things besides through that play with music. But my love, if we go back to the 19th of February 1979, my true love, my enduring passion has always been opera. And so I think eventually, after I finished touring with White Baptist Aberfan, that was over a period of 5 years, we toured around Australia. We came to Canberra twice and overseas for a number of years as well. By the time I'd finished with that one-woman show, I knew I had to write an opera, but I did not have a story. But I'll tell you, I was sitting in a cafe in Fremantle I'm getting to the answer of your question. You won't believe me, but I am.
I'm liking this journey.
All right,
so
I'm taking
with
you there. I'm taking you there. So I've done all of these other shows, and they haven't been my composition. And I get to this cafe in Fremantle, and I'm in a show being directed by beautiful Wesley Enoch, and I'm sitting in this cafe, and you know what it's like in WA. You're in the sun all the time, so I'm blacking up, and I'm loving it. I mean, I have a Melbourne tan now, and it's hard. What am I saying? I'm in Canberra. But for the people watching at home, you'll know. But here I am in WA, and I'm blacking up, and I'm sitting, and I'm having my coffee. And I've been asked just that day, "Oh, where are you from, dear? You've got lovely coloured skin. What would you call that colour of your skin?" And it's like, does anybody else get that question? What do you call the colour of your skin? You know, you're right. Okay. And I was sitting there musing about that and thinking, well, what is it? You know, it's not latte coloured. It's not latte. And I looked up, and there was this cabinet of cakes, you know, one of those refrigerated cabinets. And there, front and centre, was this pecan pie. I thought, I'm having me some of that pie. Brought it over, and I thought, yeah, kind of pecan. And it came to me at that moment, Pecan Summer. It was back in the days when you still had a diary that you used to write in. And mine was always a little black diary, Let's of London. I always got the same design every single year. And I remember I turned to the back page where there was a notes section. I wrote Pecan Summer. And Pecan Summer, that title stayed with me for 6 years. I had that title for 6 years. 6 years later, after writing that title down, I find that I'm in Melbourne, and I'm talking to senior elder Ngawit Auntie Carolyn Briggs, senior Bunurong woman. She's on her own country. We're there in Naarm. And she says, "Deborah, so I loved White Baptist Aberfan all those years ago. What are you going to do next?" And I said, "Well, Aunt, I've got a title for something, but I don't have the story. I have a title without a story." She said, "Have you been up to Shepparton? Have you been up home?" And that kind of stabs at you as a stolen generation person, because you don't actually always know where home is. I would expand that to say it's difficult for any Australian to really know where home is, because colonisation messed that up right at the very beginning for all of us, in a very brutal fashion for First Nations people, and in a particularly targeted and brutal fashion for stolen generation children. But Aunt knew that. Auntie Carolyn knew. She knew what she was saying. Go home. Go home. Take your title of whatever this is going to be, take it up to Shep. And I did. And I met with elders there who connected me to home and gave a meaning to that title. Because when I was there, and I'm ashamed to say that I didn't know this, but I didn't know anything about the walk-off from Kamranganja Mission Station in 1939, the first mass walk-off of Aboriginal people in this country. So much leadership came out of that. Auntie Jerry Briggs, William Cooper, Jack Patton, Sir Doug Nichols and Auntie Gladys. All those incredible leaders. They'd walked off country. And I'm sitting there in Shepparton, I'm hearing this story for the first time, and I'm saying, this is the opera that I need to write. So I go home and I do some research. I go back to Melbourne, I'm researching, and I'm thinking, this story, the walk-off from Kamranganja Mission Station, 1939. I'm going to take a poll in the audience who are here. If you're hearing about the walk-off from Kamranganja Mission Station for the first time, can you put up your hand? Okay, then my trip to Canberra was worthwhile just for that. Because you need to know about this. Because in 1939, 200 men, women and children of the Yorta Yorta Nation walked off that mission station that they'd been herded onto for their own protection in an act of defiance, and they crossed the River Bangarra, more recently known as the Murray. They crossed the Bangarra from New South Wales into Victoria in an act of defiance. The story celebrated in From Little Things, Big Things Grow with Vincent Lingiari is much later. This was the first. They walked off in 1939. 1939, the depths of the Depression. We're on the edge, the very edge of the Second World War. And yet they took their self-determination into their own hands and they walked off that country in an act of defiance. That is a story deserving of an opera. So I went back up to Shep to meet with someone that I knew of who was 9 years old when the walk-off took place. Auntie Frances Matheson. And I sat down with Auntie Frances and she said, "Love, this story you want to write, tell me, before I tell you anything about my experience, who's your family?" Again, that stabbing fear that I don't know something that I should know. And I make the point again, I reckon every Australian needs to have that fear, own it and acknowledge it in their own lives, because it happened to us all. We don't know what we should know. And it leaves us vulnerable and exposed. My response is to write opera because it's powerful. And so I said to Auntie Frances, "Well, Auntie Frances, my family, I was dislocated from them at the age of 3 weeks. I was taken from my mother, Monica. But it's the little family, and my uncle is Jimmy. And my uncles and aunties would perhaps be known to you." And she just smiled. She smiled. And she said, "Your grandparents were part of the Kamranganja walk-off. They carried their firstborn, Jimmy, in their arms as an 18-month-old when they walked off country. Not off country, off the mission. It was still their country. That border doesn't really exist. You understand that, don't you? Between New South Wales and Victoria, it's a fictitious border. They walked and they swam and they took the hand-winched punt that was driven by a one-legged operator across the Bangarra from New South Wales into Victoria, out of reach of the Aboriginal Protection Board. Was there ever a more ironic name for anything? How is that not deserving of an opera that everybody would see? So I had the story and I had the permission. I actually had the family connection. And so I set about writing Pecan Summer, but you know what? It was going to be impossible. There's a man in the audience tonight who knows why. His name's Don Christopher. And he was the only other living First Nations opera singer that I knew about. He'd reached out to me a couple of years before, and I thought, well, I can write a soprano and a baritone duet. I know that much. He's going to be my husband in this story. And so I started to write the libretto. And Don, I want to acknowledge you as a Gungari man here tonight. And I'm going to get to Dangala Children's Choir because I can see Cody Muhammad sitting up there, and my heart just leapt out of my chest when I saw you come in, darling. The first thing I actually did to create Pecan Summer was to create a children's choir. That happened before there was a short black opera. In 2008, I established Dangala Children's Choir, named it right after the river there. It had to start with children. It had to start with children. They're going to be the continuation of this. It had to start with children. Dangala Children's Choir was established a year before short black opera was established. A year before Pecan Summer, before I began to write Pecan Summer in earnest. So Pecan Summer became the story of my grandfather and my grandmother's resilience. I should say at this point, my grandfather was a Yuin man, and the Yuin people are not so very far away from here on the beautiful Sapphire Coast. Bermagui, Narooma and Bega were the country that he knew, and that beautiful Gulaga mountain. So strong within me is the storytelling through music, strong within every single person in this room. But for the First Nations people, strongest of all for us, because we've never been dislocated from that truth. That is how we know and give meaning to the world. Why on earth would I ever accept that I would be locked out of something as magnificent as opera as a way of expressing that inheritance that was passed down to me through millennia, through my grandparents. That's how Pecan Summer came to be.
But also a form where having it in another language is perfect also too.
Sure, and you know, it had to start. It had to start with Yorta Yorta language. And so it began with the creation story of how the Dangala was created. And there are 2 moments in the opera that are in language. The rest is in English because it's an historic piece from 1939. What do you think happened to us if we spoke our language in 1939? We were brutally punished in all manner of ways, particularly having our children taken from us. So it had to be in English to be truthful. But it didn't start in deficit. I never wanted Pecan Summer to start as deficit tale. We had to start with wholeness so Australia could see what that looked like, because in 2009-10 when I was writing this, we were not at the point where we were looking at this. We were not. We'd just been through the long winter of the Howard years. We were not in the place where we were looking at the wholeness. We were not there. So I had to start that opera in language and with wholeness. And thank you to Sharon Atkinson, who's one of the co-authors of one of the great texts that all of Yorta language has been built upon. That wonderful resource, that language book, along with Heaven Bowie and also Auntie Lois Peeler. They preserved that language, and Sharon translated for the very first time for the libretto of Pecan Summer. Sharon Atkinson wrote down the Dangala creation story of how Bayami, our creator, wanted to get something really difficult done. So what did he do? He sent a woman. He sent down a woman, Gomukha, a woman ancient and wise, to carve out a path in the sand. And behind her came Dunatpan, the giant mythical snake. And then Bayami sent down the rain and filled that river. And where it flows through Yorta Yorta country, it's called Dangala. Can you say that word for me? Dangala. There you go. How beautiful is that? You know, Arnie Lil once told me, you must always speak the word Dangala with reverence, with respect, and speak it gently, because it is the source of life for us. How beautiful is that? To have a word that you have to embed, you have to invest in it so much. You know, opera singers, we invest in language our whole career. And opera singers' development really is, it's 10, 15, 20, it's ongoing your whole career, but it's at least 10 years before you can have a meaningful career. It's a real investment. It's a real investment, like our senior song men and women, where it's a lifetime in the making of knowledge, and the acquisition of that knowledge is experiential. You had to be there. And the thing is, I could never have written Pecan Summer had I not been there. I couldn't have written about there had I not been there. And I think actually what I'm saying here, maybe for the first time, because it's really hitting home to me and dawning on me, I was there. I was there in my grandmother. I was there in my grandfather. I also went there and lived that experience. I took the whole company, because it started with Don, and then we got 4 more singers. In our first year of development, we had 5 adult singers, and by the next year we had 15. Last time we did Pecan Summer, we had a company. I think our production manager, Matt Schroders, he had to make 80 lanyards for that production at the Sydney Opera House. We're a big company. No way was I going to let Australia off the hook to say, oh yes, now we're talking about Indigenous opera, that means Deborah. Or that means Deborah and Don, because gender balance. No, there had to be a company on that stage saying, we're all doing that. We're all doing it. And you know, we're doing it alongside experienced non-Indigenous singers as well, so that they can play the roles that they have to play.
What was it about getting Pecan Summer on the stage at the Sydney Opera House. What was that experience like?
It was a promise that I made to the company the year we formed it in 2010, when Pecan Summer premiered. It premiered on the 9th of October 2010. The very next day, my great idol in my life of opera passed away, breathed her last, Dame Joan Sutherland. It was a momentous weekend. I went from this to this. But at that time, I made a promise to the company. We will perform this again, and we will one day perform this at the Sydney Opera House. We went the next year, 2011, to Melbourne. 97% box office, thank you very much. Melbourne was hungry for that story. We went the following year to Adelaide. We went the following year to Perth, Adelaide, and then Sydney. The Sydney Opera House, I had to go into a ballot to get the date for our production to go on in the concert hall of the Sydney Opera House. You better believe that I put my music teacher and mentor and lifelong friend Jennifer King and her husband Lionel into seats L23 and 22. I did it. I made sure of that night. I wanted to connect that, but I had to go into a ballot. My company, that was already 5 years old by that stage, had to go into a ballot to get the date. They gave us 1 day to bump it in and perform it. Bump it in, tech it, and perform it. Now, the ancestors are going, are you kidding? Come on, we can take care of this very easily. And there was a cancellation in the comedy festival that was also running alongside. I should add that I had approached the powers that be that were in charge of Opera Australia at that stage. They're no longer there. I think they may be working here, but anyway, I had approached someone from Opera Australia and said, look, could we do this in the Joan Sutherland Theatre? I've got the perfect set. It'll fit on that stage, beautiful. It's Joan Sutherland Theatre. It would mean so much to me. I've looked up your calendar. You don't have any performances for 2 days. We could get it in there in 2 days. The theatre's dark. Can we have it? And they said, no. No, I think we'll be cleaning the theatre that day. They didn't want to have a bar of it. They did not want to support us. So I went into the ballot for the concert hall. Nice synergy about going into the concert hall, right? That was where my first operatic experience was. But we had 1 day. Well, ancestors took care of that. There was a cancellation in the comedy festival. We had 2 days. And my amazing team, my director that I brought on that year, Cameron Menzies, hello to you. I know you've got a special night tonight in Melbourne, but I know you'll watch this back on replay. Cameron, my production manager, Matt, and that beautiful company that we had built up from just 2 singers, from my grandmother and my grandfather's story. We did it. We brought it into that theatre. We brought new technology that had never been used in the concert hall before, where we used 3D projection. It wraps around a space and it basically breaks down, not that there is a fourth wall in there, it's not a proscenium arch theatre, but it brings the audience into the scene. When we crossed the Bangarra, and Cody Muhammad was there as a senior member of Pecan Summer Children's Chorus, when we crossed the Bangarra, the audience crossed it with us. When we went into that little, lean-to shack that my grandparents would have lived in on the Marupna Flats after they'd walked off, the audience were in there. When the giant Byalla, the River Red Gum, was shading that shack, we were all shaded by that. It was an amazing production. It won 9 Broadway World Awards. I'm very proud of those Broadway World Awards because it competed with Opera Australia and all the other companies in the country at that time. We went into a ballot to get that space. That's where we were in 2016. It's 22, I think it is, those pandemic years. They've left me quite confused.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, the 10th anniversary of Pecan Summer has come and gone, and I wonder, because of the pandemic and where it's sat, that 10th anniversary, I know this has been on your mind. What has been the process of looking back at that 10 years, not having the ability to be able to celebrate that 10 years?
That was
and
tough.
now we're 12 years.
It
You're
was
up to number
tough.
12, you know. What was going through your head not being able to celebrate that decade?
Well, first I would say in that decade, Don went on to do incredible things with other opera companies and has sung as a soloist many times. Some of the original Pecan Summer Children's Chorus grew up, got married, had their own children. It's a great way of keeping a choir going. Just keep, keep having children. People were doing other things, but in 2020, Don was going to come back, be my husband again. Now, for a lesbian, I've had a lot of husbands in that show, can I say? I've had 3 husbands. And Don was going to come back, and he was going to be my husband again. He was going to play the role of James that he created in 2010. And we're going to invite a whole lot of the company members back. Judd Clerk, brilliant filmmaker, was going to make her debut directing it on stage at the Melbourne Recital Centre, of course, the pandemic. And we didn't get to have that 10-year impact. And I think we're paying for that now. Because back when we took Pecan Summer to Melbourne, straight after Maripna, 2011, we went to Melbourne, we sold out, 97% box office, over 3 performances. Like Arts Centre Melbourne marketing staff called me in and said, tell us how you did that. I said, people are hungry for this. People want to know, they want to experience this, they want to understand. Not only know, actually, knowing's just a tiny bit of the journey. It's the bigger journey is the understanding journey, yeah? You can know something and do terrible damage with that without understanding. And people wanted to understand, and they came in 2011. But that wasn't the opera audience, mostly. That was another audience. And I could see, because I plot this course, when we started out in 2010, I might have even said this to you, Don, but I certainly said it to other people. This year Bangarra is 20 years old. When short black opera is 20 years old, I want to be where Bangarra is. Well, we're 14 years old now. We're still sleeping on other people's couches. We still don't have a home. We're still not funded. I think that can change. But when we didn't get to have that 2020 season, what we missed out on is all of that opera community coming along and seeing what opera can be. What opera can be in its fullest sense to Australians. Not at the exclusion. I'm not into this notion of mutual exclusivity. I don't believe in it. Not in the exclusion of the Western canon. Not at all. I mean, there are some operas that won't survive the 21st century, and nor should they. But honestly, there's room enough for all, but our stories deserve to be told, and Pecan Summer does that. It ends with the moment Kevin Rudd stood in a building not very far from here and delivered the apology to the stolen generations. It ends with that scene. It is the only opera I know of that actually has spoken word recording of an Australian Prime Minister saying something worthy of being said. I get emotional thinking about it right now. Writing the music that went with part of that speech. We deserve to have those operas. Now, there are a lot of Australian composers who are writing very fine works, and they get one life. They get maybe one showing or maybe 2. Pecan Summer has been seen in 5 different theatres from a little company that most days is just 2 people, myself and my beautiful partner, Tony Lalich, OAM. Most days, short black opera is just 2 people, because that's what has to happen when you're not funded, when you don't get, the $6 million from a state government or the $25 million from a federal government. When you're just doing the thing that has to get done, sometimes it's just 2 people. And then we get that project on a stage, and we were ready to do that in Melbourne. We were ready to do it. And I was ready to welcome in the opera community and say, this is what opera can be. Yes, it can be Carmen. Contextualise it, please. That is the most hideous domestic violence situation right there. Don't cancel Carmen. You don't have to. You just need to call it for what it is. It needs to be a tragedy when that woman dies, stabbed to death by her lover. It needs to be a tragedy, not a fait accompli. Tragedy. You can tell that story. Put it on. Can I stop you? There are probably 12 versions of Carmen happening right this very second. It's kind of like, what was that show? Was it Skippy? Somewhere in the world, Skippy was being shown every minute of the day, our whole lives growing up. You can have Carmen, you can have Tosca, you can have Bohème. Australia deserves to have its own story, but you know what? It's kind of hard to get that over the line when people haven't reconciled it within themselves of what actually happened here. And that 2/3 of this audience have been denied the information from your education that there was such a thing as the Kamranganja walk-off. I do a similar poll when I'm talking about Umarala, a war requiem for peace, which is the large-scale choral work that I've written in recognition of a war of attrition that was fought. The defence of Gunditjmara land was fought in the southwest of Victoria for 23 years. 23 years. And if I took a poll here now, I would say the same number of people would probably say, well, let's do it. Umarala, the war that lasted from 1840 to 1863, where the population of the Gunditjmara people were reduced from something like 9,000 down to just 77. Have you heard of this war? Have you never heard of this war? You deserve to know about that war. How can you know your belonging to this continent as an Australian without knowing that? And this is where music plays the role that only music can play, supported by all the other arts as it is in opera. Music will convey a truth that will transcend the analytical, that is flawed because we don't have all the information. It will allow that truth to enter into you in a way that nothing else can communicate. That is why opera is so important. That is why Indigenous opera is so important. Short Black Opera was the first Indigenous opera company in the world. We went into a ballot to get the concert hall. We have great partnerships in Melbourne. I'm from Sydney originally. Well, actually, no. I'm from Yuin country originally. That's where I was born, in Nowra. Taken from my mother, and I grew up with the Cheetham family, a loving family in Sydney, Darrell country. I deserve to have that information. You deserve to have that information. How can we piece it all together unless we have the information?
Well, Deb, what would you say in terms of, what are the challenges going forward then for opera in this country? You've touched on some of them now, but, what else have you been thinking about
opera
over this time?
struggles with diversity. Struggles with diversity. Look it up on Google. Every single artistic director of a state opera company in this country is a white male. And I'm not saying they're not talented. They are, obviously. They must be, right? They're in those positions. And they're doing their best to keep opera afloat. But how can they possibly be doing it when the other side of the population are not represented anywhere? It's a struggle for women. It's a struggle for women. And it's a struggle for opera to survive because it just isn't balanced. It isn't balanced. My solution for that is appoint a gender balance and get some people of colour in there and put them on your boards. And make sure they're on your selection panels when positions come up. That is so very important. But here's what happens. And I'm not making excuses for the lay of the land at the moment, but I reckon this plays into it. A number of years ago, the Australia Council was decimated when funding was ripped out brutally. And ever since that time, and even before that, arts organisations were turned into the Hunger Games in this country. Why is that? Why set arts organisations up against one another to compete for these ever diminishing returns? Why do that? You don't understand the arts? You don't value them? No. Quite the opposite. The people who ripped that funding out, the people who neglected artists and the arts over the last 2 years of pandemic, they knew exactly the potency and the power of the arts. You want an emotionally mature and nuanced and informed society, you have to have the arts. There's actually no other way of getting there. Do you want an informed, emotionally mature electorate that can think for themselves? If you've got absolutely no ideas and you're morally bankrupt, then no, you don't want people to know. And so arts organisations have been turned against one another. You know, this has been deliberate. So how do we fight back? We find the people who want to come out on a chilly Canberra night. We put them in this room and we say, be ready to ask the question at the end. Remember, I said that earlier before we went on. Ask the question, and some of you will want to make a statement, and that's okay too, because you want to be heard. Ask it of your opera companies, not at the expense of the Western canon. But one day, we might be confident enough as a nation to say, we've got our own stories, and we've got some really good composers. Let's see what they can do with our stories. Let's see what we can achieve as a nation when we go back to doing what our ancestors did, and to every other First Nations person in this room. And at some time in your ancestors' life, before it was dislocated from the arts as a way of knowing and giving meaning to the world. For we who've never been dislocated from that, ask yourself, what could we do with that together? Ask your opera companies to tell your stories. See yourself reflected there on that stage. You're entitled to. They're publicly funded, many of them. Not SBO, but hey, we're coming to the end of June and we are DGR. But here's the thing, we make ends meet whatever way we can. Currently, I'm funding short black opera from all of my other work as a composer. That's what I'm doing right now. And I will do it until that needs to change. Well, it needs to change until it can change. And I think it will. I think for starters, and you can applaud here because I'm setting it up for you, so you better slam dunk. We have an arts policy. And I will tell you who was invited to sing at the launch of that arts policy in St Kilda at the Esplanade Theatre, one of the founding members of Short Black Opera, Shante Batsky, sang at the launch of the arts policy. They get it. And I'm going to hold them to their promise. And I was on the phone to Tony just last week, saying, I will do what I need to do to support you in the things you've promised to do for this nation. What benefits First Nations people benefits absolutely every single Australian. You better believe that. If ever it became the truth that it wasn't benefiting every Australian, then we will have become morally bankrupt and we will have abandoned the nuance and the beauty of First Nations way of being. It is collective. It is not about the individual. That's why I had to have a company. That's why I had to have a children's choir that will come on that journey and believe and invest in it as they did. Gee, I wish we'd had that 20th anniversary. There's no other way of helping the opera community know that there can be something else just as beautiful as what they work hard on. And they do work hard. It's not a piece of cake, it is difficult, especially with those ever diminishing returns. It's a challenge. It's a challenge for Short Black Opera. Next year, I'm jumping in on a question. Can I do this about Pawang? Do you mind me saying?
You can. I was going to say we're probably getting close to questions, so I'll let you answer that and then I will open the floor. So if you have a question, we do have a microphone, so please put your hand up. Continue, Deb.
You had so many incredible things that
You've pretty much covered it.
Did I do it?
You can do it, yeah.
Okay, all right.
You're fine. It's okay. She was really worried about that.
Yeah. No, but can I say, this woman here, how excited I was to have this conversation with you, how incredibly fearless you are in going into, as you say, the deep dive, in wearing the diva skirt, because it's in order of opera, but going in there and saying, hey, I don't know something. Guess what? I'm not devoid of curiosity. I will find out. That's what it's about. Don't be fearful of what you don't know. Be fearful of not bothering to find out. That actually is the problem. For us, one of the beautiful things that we were almost able to achieve in partnership with our state opera, Victorian Opera last year, was I was commissioned to write a new opera, Pawang Lifts the Sky, and I was very, very proud to invite Don back on stage as Bunjil, the creator, for the Warawarang people of that Geelong area. And boy, we came close, didn't we, Don? We came so close. In the development period of that opera, we had 2 lockdowns, and the last one, we needed just 24 hours to get in that theatre, and we could have broadcast out to 4,000 school children, because only Melbourne was locked down in that particular lockdown. Melbourne was locked down. The children in the regions who were going to come and see it live streamed were all ready to go. They were going to go into the theatres and into the civic centres of where they lived in the regional and rural Victoria. 4,000 kids were signed up to see Pawang Lifts the Sky, a beautiful metaphor for lifting ignorance from people's lives. The story of how Pawang the magpie gave human beings the first sunrise. Excuse me, I'm going to have to cough. We were so ready. We went into lockdown. All we needed was 24 hours in the theatre. And there was an exemption process in Victoria. You could apply for an exemption, and so we did. CEO, Victorian Opera, Elizabeth Hill Cooper applied for an exemption for us to get into that theatre 24 hours before so that we could get that broadcast at least out to those children. Exemption never made it off the pile. Never went to committee. Meanwhile, sporting codes were free range across the country. I knew, like a sore leg, that weather is coming. I knew every time I watched the AFL, every time they left town, I knew a lockdown was happening 3 days later. You could set your watch by it. Now, I don't begrudge sport anything. Remember my tennis days, right back at the beginning of this talk? I love sport. I have a team. It's St Kilda, all right? My father-in-law goes for St Kilda. It was a diplomatic thing to do. NRL team, St George. Illawarra, begrudgingly. But here's the thing. I saw exemptions go to sporting codes, left, right and centre. And Pawang Lifts the Sky, the second ever Indigenous opera in Australia. The first time a state company has commissioned an Indigenous composer to write a creation story. It was a compelling application. Didn't make it off the pile. Did not make it off the pile. See, that's the kind of challenge you don't think about. You think of all the logistical challenges, how you can get the funding, whatever. Didn't make it off the exemptions pile. The ballet were in the theatre next to us. They got an exemption because they were deemed to be elite athletes. All right, I'm not as athletic as I used to be, but hey, I can climb to a top C easily enough if I have to. We have to have questions, don't you? What I want to say, NAIDOC week next year, I'm going to put in a plug. NAIDOC week next year, for those of you at home, Arts Centre Melbourne, in the Playhouse where it was designed, Short Black Opera will produce Pawang Lifts the Sky. And Don Brimrose has agreed that he will come and sing the role of Bunjil for those live audiences. I hope you will come. And I think it's a beautiful story, one that deserves to be seen live. We did record it, we did film it, although I don't think that's available at the moment. If you're interested in Pecan Summer, though, it is available on demand on SBS, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, SBS.
And the documentary we made, Secrets of Pecan Summer. So you can go on SBS anytime and watch the Sydney Opera House In for a Day production, and be proud that you're in a country that has the longest continuing, oldest music practice in the world, and we tell that however we want to, from hip-hop to opera.
Might open it up to questions now. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will get a runner with a microphone to come towards you.
See,
Oh.
it was good to tell them
Question
before.
here.
'Cause
Mike's
it's
coming
gone.
across. Thank
Here we
you
go.
so much. It's always hard being the first person.
Hi, Deborah. Look,
Hi.
you're absolutely right about this inequality. On the weekend, and ABC are the ones who lead inequality in Australia when it comes to arts, held their annual 100 greatest movie and games music. 3% of it was female composers, and nothing is changing anywhere that I can see. I was at the con in the 80s as well, and it was a pretty horrendous white place, and women weren't looked at, they weren't interested in as composers. If you were a female composer, you were joked at, Margaret Sutherland's husband.
Yeah.
They had a mental issue if you wanted to be a female composer. I have no idea how we can do anything about this in Australia because it just continues. It happened on the weekend.
Film music is, thank you for, sorry, what was your name? Rob. Thank you for that question, Rob. Film music is an area that, you've got people like Jessica Wells kicking goals, and she's already had some awards and she's going to get more awards, and I great admiration for her. And I'm not sorry that Star Wars won. Have you heard my ringtone? It's like, sorry, spoiler alert. But there is a fine example, and you could go to any of the top 100s and you will not hear women's voices hardly at all, let alone Australian female voices in there. And so you can do something about that, because every movement that we make in our lives is being monitored. It's being tracked through your phone. So if you're listening to music and you're making some random choices and you want to try something new, then actively seek out a female composer. Actively seek that out, or write into ABC and say, please program more of Mary Finstra, who was at the con with me. We're in the same year. She left the BMAS course and went into composition. I'm yet to have the conversation with her how hard that must have been at that time in 1983 when we first started there, because it must have been very difficult, but she did it. And now here she is, this celebrated composer. Yeah, it is really difficult, but you have agency in this, and you can decide what you want to listen to, and you can ask that of the ABC, and they will give it to. I feel very privileged to have a lot of my music on the ABC, but what happens is, because I'm a living composer, the rights that you have to pay to living composers, because hey, they want to make a living. Who's thunk it? It precludes programming living composers all the time because it's costly. And as we know, again, another great institution that we rely upon so heavily, the ABC has had its funding shredded, and that needs to be restored, and I believe it will be in time. So it's difficult. The top 100 is always going to be difficult. When I was working at ABC Classic, I did a couple of different shows. The Sunday opera program was the last one I did. But I was presenting the afternoon drive time program at one point, and it was on International Women's Day. And we actually got hate mail from people about, how dare you play music by females? Can't we have all the really good stuff? Why do we have to listen to this? Well, I'm sorry, if you don't know who Lily Boulanger is, do yourselves a favour. And you will say to yourselves, how can I have lived this long without hearing Lily Boulanger, Nadia's younger sister? She was the first woman to win the Prix de Rome. She was 18 when she won the Prix de Rome. She died at 24 from Crohn's disease. She was what Ravel and Debussy hoped to become. Honestly, she was amazing. Do yourself a favour. Know about her. And whenever I'm asked, and I'm always asked, and I have lovely conversation with Vanessa Hughes about who are my three composers, I will always choose. Well, I've got to have something that Joan sang, so there's got to be some, Bellini or some Donizetti in there. But I will always put Lily right before people, because how do you know unless you start that conversation? It's not at the exclusion of everything and everyone else. How did we get to be so fearful about that? We were taught that fear, right? We were taught that fear, that somehow you're going to lose your backyards if there's native title. There's a wonderful exhibition here. If you don't go and see the Mabo exhibition, you're really missing out on something. You must go and see it. That has been curated by family. You need to go in there and see it and celebrate what that meant. All that fear that you've been taught from day one, we can do without it, quite frankly. It's a real burden. It's exhausting. I can't live a life in fear.
Any other questions?
You know you want to. Go on.
Oh, here we
go. Here we go. Good.
Hi, Deborah. I was just wondering, you mentioned that we can watch Pecan Summer on SBS, and obviously that brings a much wider audience in, and it's great that those of us who wouldn't have had the opportunity otherwise can experience it. But do you think is there any impact that's lost by not being able to be sitting in the theatre watching it live?
It certainly is a different experience. I think one of the great strengths of Pecan Summer is the truth of the story. Every single line in that libretto is something that's been said to me at some time, or that has been said. So there's an impact and a truth through the libretto and the sung performance. But we should never abandon live performance. We should never, because you do have to be there to understand what it is to have the vibration created by someone who has honed their craft for decades. To have that vibration pass through you is a really intimate act of relationship between the stage and the audience, and you can't get that any other way other than being there. So I would never give up on that, never give up on the live experience. And I never say never, well, to most things, but I would say that, there could be a Pecan Summer again. I feel that I won't ever sing Ella again. I think 2020 was my chance. If I'm truthful to the aims and ambitions of short black opera, that has to go to someone else in the company now, before they feel too old to sing it. So there was a kind of moment of grief that had to come to me, that I wouldn't sing that again. But I think Pecan Summer will be seen again. But, short black opera, we did all of that really intense work to begin with the singers that we found, with the 5 who started off in 2008 in the spring intensives, 2009, 2010. And that's led to other singers being encouraged to come forward. We've got a soprano we've been mentoring who's over at the Royal Northern College right now, Sarah Prestwick, Wiradjuri woman. And I feel like we could have so many more, but the organisations, the companies, the larger properly funded companies, they need to do some heavy lifting. And that is not just about bringing people in on a one-off, whatever. They need to do some of the development work that short black opera did. And we were able to do that in the early days because I had a role at the Victorian College of the Arts. And I was Associate Dean Indigenous there. And so we had facilities and we had funding through the Willan Centre, and we did a lot of our work because short black opera had a home. We've been homeless since I left VCA after it was subsumed by Uni Melb. So I feel like it's harder for us to do the work. So if you're an opera company, if you're a CEO or an artistic director, and I know you all, hello, nice to see you, and I do love you. Don't think anything I've said means that I don't. I do. I love what you can do with your company. The other thing you need to do with your company is make sure that we are represented there, because we are the truth of the story of this country. And you need to be doing everything you can to develop the young talent so that someone can see themselves reflected on your stages and they can dream, as I did the moment that I saw Leona Mitchell, that one day I will sing Tosca. Oh, I haven't done that, but I've done lots of other things, and maybe Tosca would have got in the way, who knows.
Still to come. On that note, Deb, I might leave it there and I might invite Rebecca from the National Library back up to close us out.
Thank you so very much. It's so obvious that what you're driven by is what me and my team and what we do here are driven by, and that's that need to ensure that our stories are told and heard, and that people have the opportunity, as you said, to educate themselves. And as you said, we've had a process here at the library of having some difficult conversations with staff over the last 18 months about raising the cultural capacity of the organisation. And time again we heard, why wasn't I taught that at school? And I agree, why weren't you taught that at school? But you know what? It comes a point where you can decide and it becomes a choice. Yes, you weren't taught it at school, but to continue to not know our history is an active choice.
I need to add something, and I'm sorry if I'm keeping you and the lights are going to go off, but I'll say it in the dark if I need to. It is also not a question of us being invited in, to be included in what is the central thing that we're all orbiting around. I don't believe in that. I believe we need the agency to tell our own stories. And we need capacity. And we need the space. And sometimes that means somebody else getting out of the way for a time, if they believe it enough to let that happen. It's not about saying, oh, well then I'll invite you in to tell a story that I then own. No, it's not about that. It's about making way for the agency that will include you always. It's about that.
Absolutely. Who's telling whose story is so important. And you know, I was reflecting that there are a couple of extraordinary young people in my family who are part of your chorus, your children's choir in Sydney. Yeah, and they are the grandchildren of my very beautiful aunt, who was taken away from her family at the age of 13 with 7 brothers and sisters, the youngest of whom was my then 18-month-old mother. And for them to have had that agency, as you say, and that opportunity to take to that stage with that story, and through your words tell their story as well, was something quite amazing.
I want to say something, because we've lost the live feed, I guess. Cody, you were there that night. You were there in Sydney. Well, how old? Can you remember how old you were in 2016? Can you do that? You're 15 years old. You're standing on that stage as a young woman from Shepparton, telling that story from Shepparton and surrounds. Like, how did that feel?
Pretty immaculate. It's undescribable. Yeah, never had that same feeling again.
I want to make sure that you do get that same feeling again. And that very first time, Don, when we stood on that stage in Marupna and we looked out at that audience, and 80% of the audience were Indigenous, and 80% of that 80% belonged to that story. Like, how did that feel? 2010.
I don't think I got the magnitude of it at the time, but I remember our beautiful friend Jonathan Welsh, who is one of Australia's finest tenors and incredible, and he said he had never experienced that response ever on stage, ever. It was very special, that very first audience, and it'll stick with me forever. But I'm not sure that I've got the words to articulate how special it was, but it was, for me, it was seeing someone who I admire in Jonathan, who's to me performed at the highest of highs in this country in opera, saying that he'd never experienced anything like that. You know, and that's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, sometimes we do have to stand back and allow someone else to articulate it. And those original non-Indigenous company members, they all found it so difficult. Re-entry to the rest of life after that was difficult. They all said it without exception. Sorry that I'm hijacking this, but when you've got 2 company members in the room, you've got 3 First Nations opera singers in this room. Would you mind standing up and just taking some applause from this room? Stand up, yeah. Anything I've been able to do, it was because people like Cody and people like Don said, yep, I'll put my hand up for that. Doesn't matter, no one else is doing it, has done it. Doesn't matter if no one believes you can do it, I'll be there with you. That's how it happened. Want to know how it happened? And how it's going to happen next year and for the rest of my life and beyond? It's because of people like that. That's how it happened. And you. Because who's the most important people in the room when we get into the theatre, Cody? The audience, yes. Sorry, I hijacked that.
So it just, I guess, falls to me to say, please, once again, join me in thanking Deb and Rhianna for a wonderful evening, and do join us in August for our 3rd and final in this series of Deadly Dialogues, which will be a wonderful yarn with Rachel Maza. Thank you again for coming, everyone. Thank you,